Hello, this is the final reading of The Golden Age by Kenneth Grahame. We're up to the last two chapters. Chapter 16, A Falling Out. Harold told me the main facts of this episode some time later, in bits and with reluctance. It was not a recollection he cared to talk about. The crude blank misery of a moment is apt to leave a dull bruise which is slow to depart, if it ever do so entirely, and Harold confesses to a twinge or two, still, at times, like the veteran who brings home a bullet inside him from Marshall Plains oversea. He knew he was a brute the moment he had done it. Selina had not meant to worry, only to comfort and assist, but his soul was one raw sore within him, when he found himself shut up in the schoolroom after hours, merely for insisting that 7 times 7 amounted to 47. The injustice of it seemed so flagrant. Why not 47 as much as 49? One number was no prettier than the other to look at, and it was evidently only a matter of arbitrary taste and preference, and anyhow, it had always been 47 to him, and would be to the end of time. So when Selina came in out of the sun, leaving the trappers of the far west behind her, and putting off the glory of being an Apache squaw in order to hear him his tables, and win his release, Harold turned on her venomously, rejected her kindly overtures, and even drove his elbow into her sympathetic ribs in his determination to be left alone in the glory of sulks. The fit passed directly. His eyes were opened and his soul sat in the dust as he sorrowfully began to cast about for some atonement heroic enough to salve the wrong. Of course, poor Selina looked for no sacrifice, nor heroics whatever. She didn't even want him to say he was sorry. If he would only make it up, she would have done the apologising part herself. But that was not a boy's way. Something solid, Harold felt, was due from him. And until that was achieved, making up must not be thought of, in order that the final effect not be spoilt. Accordingly, when his release came and Selina hung about trying to catch his eye, Harold, possessed by the demon of a distorted motive, avoided her steadily, though he was bleeding inwardly at every minute of delay, and came to me instead. Needless to say, I warmly approved his plans. It was so much more high-toned than just going and making up tamely, which anyone could do, and a girl who had been jobbed in the ribs by a hostile elbow could not be expected for a moment to overlook it, without the lineament of an offering to soothe her injured feelings. "I know what she most wants," said Harold. "She wants that set of tea things in the toy shop window with the red and blue flowers on 'em. She has wanted it for months because her dolls are getting big enough to have real afternoon tea, and she wants it so badly that she won't walk that side of the street when we go into the town, but it costs 5 shillings. Then we set to work seriously and devoted the afternoon to a realisation of assets and the composition of a budget that might have been dated without shame from Whitehall. The result worked out as follows. By one uncle, unspent, through having been lost for nearly a week, turned up at last in the straw of the dog kennel, 2 and 6. By advance from me, on security of next uncle, and failing that to be called in at Christmas, 1 shilling. By shaken out of missionary box with the help of a knife blade, they were our own pennies and a forced levy, 4pence. By bet due from Edward for walking across the field where Farmer Larkin's bull was, and Edward bet him 2pence he couldn't, called in with difficulty, 2pence. By advance from Martha on no security at all, only you mustn't tell your aunt, 1 shilling, total 5 shillings. And at last we breathed again. The rest promised to be easy, Selina had a tea party at 5 on the morrow with the chipped old wooden tea things that had served her successive dolls from babyhood. Harold would slip off directly after dinner, going alone so as not to arouse suspicion, as we were not allowed to go into town by ourselves. It was nearly 2 miles to our small metropolis, but there would be plenty of time for him to go and return, even laden with the olive branch neatly packed in shavings. Besides, he might meet the butcher, who was his friend and who would give him a lift. Then, finally, at 5, the rapture of the new tea service descended from the skies, and retribution made, making up at last without loss of dignity. With the event before us, we thought it a small thing that 24 hours more of alienation and pretended sulks must be kept up on Harold's part. But Selina, who naturally knew nothing of the treat in store for her, moped for the rest of the evening and took a very heavy heart to bed. Next day, when the hour for action arrived, Harold evaded Olympian attention with an easy modesty born of long practice, and made off for the front gate. Selina, who had been keeping her eye upon him, thought he was going down to the pond to catch frogs, a joy they had planned to share together, and made after him. But Harold, though he heard her footsteps, continued sternly on his high mission, without even looking back, and Selina was left to wander disconsolately among flower beds that had lost, for her, all scent and colour. I saw it all, and, although cold reason approved our line of action, instinct told me we were brutes. Harold reached the town, so he recounted afterwards, in record time, having run most of the way for fear the tea things, which had reposed 6 months in the window, should be snapped up by some other conscience-stricken lacerator of her sister's feelings. And it seemed hardly credible to find them still there, and their owner willing to part with them for the price marked on the ticket. He paid his money down at once, that there should be no drawing back from the bargain, and then, as the things had to be taken out of the window and packed and the afternoon was yet young, he thought he might treat himself to a taste of urban joys and the vie de bohème. Shops came first, of course, and he flattened his nose successively against the window of the Indian rubber balls, with Indian rubber balls in it, and the clockwork locomotive, and against the barber's window with wigs on blocks reminding him of uncles, and shaving cream that looked so good to eat, and the grocer's window displaying more currants than the whole British population could possibly consume without a special effort, and the window of the bank, wherein gold was thought so little of that it was dealt about in shovels. Next there was the marketplace, with all its clamorous joys, and when a runaway calf came down the street like a cannonball, Harold felt that he had not lived in vain. The whole place was so brimful of excitement that he had quite forgotten the why and wherefore of it being there, when a sight of the church clock recalled him to his better self, and sent him flying out of the town. As he realised he had only just time enough left to get back in. If he were after his appointed hour, he would not only miss his high triumph, but probably would be detected as a transgressor of bounds, a crime before which a private opinion on multiplication sank to nothingness. So he jogged along on his homeward way, thinking of many things and probably talking to himself a good deal, as was his habit. He had covered nearly half the distance when suddenly a deadly sinking in the pit of his stomach, a paralysis of every limb, around him a world extinct of light and music, a black sun and a reeling sky. He had forgotten the tea things. It was useless, it was hopeless, all was over and nothing could be done. Nevertheless, he turned and ran back wildly, blindly, choking with the big sobs that evoked neither pity nor comfort from a merciless, mocking world around. A stitch in his side, dust in his eyes, and black despair clutching at his heart. So he stumbled on with leaden legs and bursting sides, till, as if fate had not yet dealt with him her last worst buffet of all, on turning a corner in the road, he almost ran under the wheels of a dog-cart, in which, as it pulled up, was apparent the portly form of Farmer Larkin, the arch-enemy at whose ducks he had been shying stones that very morning. Had Harold been in his right and unclouded senses, he would have vanished through the hedge some seconds earlier, rather than pain the farmer by any unpleasant reminiscences which his appearance might recall. But as things were, he could only stand and blubber hopelessly, caring indeed little now what further misery might befall him. The farmer, for his part, surveyed the desolate figure with some astonishment, calling out in no unfriendly accents, "Why, Master Harold, whatever be the matter? Bain't running away, be ye?" Then Harold, with the unnatural courage born of desperation, flung himself onto the step and, climbing into the cart, fell into the straw at the bottom of it, sobbing out that he wanted to go back. The situation had a vagueness, but the farmer, a man of action rather than of words, swung his horse round smartly, and they were in the town again by the time Harold had recovered himself sufficiently to furnish details. As they drove up to the shop, the woman was waiting at the door with the parcel, and hardly a minute seemed to have elapsed since the black crisis ere they were bowling along swiftly home, the precious parcel hugged in a close embrace. And now the farmer came out in quite a new and unexpected light. Never a word did he say of broken fences and hurdles, of trampled crops and harried flocks and herds. One would have thought the man had never possessed a head of livestock in his life. Instead, he was deeply interested in the whole dolorous quest of the tea things, and sympathised with Harold on the disputed point in mathematics as if he had been himself at that same stage of education. As they neared home, Harold found himself, to his surprise, sitting up and chatting to his new friend like man to man. And before he was sat down at a convenient gap in the garden hedge, he had promised that when Selina gave her first public tea party, little Miss Larkin should be invited to come and bring her whole sawdust family along with her. And the farmer appeared as pleased and proud as if he had won a gold medal at the agricultural show. And really, when I heard the story, it began to dawn on me that those Olympians must have certain good points, far down in them, and that I should have to leave off abusing them some day. At the hour of 5, Selina, having spent the afternoon searching for Harold in all his accustomed haunts, sat down disconsolately to tea with her dolls, who ungenerously refused to wait beyond the appointed hour. The wooden tea things seemed more chipped than usual, and the dolls themselves had more of wax and sawdust and less of human colour and intelligence about them than she had ever remembered before. It was then that Harold burst in, very dusty, his stockings at his heels, and the channels ploughed by tears still showing on his grimy cheeks. And Selina was at last permitted to know that he had been thinking of her ever since his ill-judged exhibition of temper, and that his sulks had not been the genuine article. Nor had he gone frogging by himself. It was a very happy hostess who dispensed hospitality that evening to a glassy-eyed, stiff-kneed circle. Many a dollish gaucherie that would have been severely checked on ordinary occasions was as much overlooked as it had been a birthday. But Harold and I, in what I was afterwards given to understand was our stupid masculine way, thought all her happiness sprang from possession of the long-coveted tea service. The final chapter, Nusisti Satis. Among the many fatuous ideas that possessed the Olympian noddle, this one was preeminent: that, being Olympians, they could talk quite freely in our presence on subjects of the closest import to us, so long as names, dates, and other landmarks were ignored. We were supposed to be denied the faculty of putting two and two together, and like the monkeys who very sensibly refrain from speech lest they should be set to earn their livings, we were careful to conceal our capabilities for a simple syllogism. Thus we were rarely taken by surprise, and so were considered by our disappointed elders to be apathetic and to lack the divine capacity for wonder. Now, the daily output of the letter bag, with the mysterious discussions that ensued thereon, had speedily informed us that Uncle Thomas was entrusted with a mission too affecting ourselves. Uncle Thomas's missions were many and various. A self-important man, one liking the business while protesting that he sank under the burden. He was the missionary, so to speak, of our remote habitation. The matching a ribbon, the running down to the stores, the interviewing a cook, these and similar duties lent constant colour and variety to his vacant life in London, and helped to keep down his figure. When the matter, however, had in our presence to be referred to with nods and pronouns, with significant hiatuses and interpolations in the French tongue, then the red flag was flown. The storm cone hoisted, and by a studious pretence of inattention, we were not long in plucking out the heart of the mystery. To clinch our conclusions, we descended suddenly and together on Martha. Proceeding, however, not by simple inquiry as to facts, that would never have done, but by informing her that the air was full of squall and that we knew all about it, and then challenging denial. Martha was a trusty soul, but a bad witness for the defence, and we soon had it all out of her. The word had gone forth. The school had been selected. The necessary sheets were hemming even now, and Edward was the designated and appointed victim. It had always been before us as an inevitable born, this strange unknown thing called school. And yet, perhaps I should say consequently, we had never seriously set ourselves to consider what it really meant. But now that the grim spectre loomed imminent, stretching lean hands for one of our flock, it behoved us to face the situation, to take soundings in this uncharted sea and find out whither we were drifting. Unfortunately, the data in our possession was absolutely insufficient, and we knew not whither to turn for exact information. Uncle Thomas could have told us all about it, of course. He had been there himself once in the dim and misty past. But an unfortunate conviction that nature had intended him for a humorist tainted all his evidence, besides making it wearisome to hear. Again, of such among our contemporaries as we had approached, the trumpets gave forth an uncertain sound. According to some, it meant larks, revels, emancipation, and a foretaste of the bliss of manhood. According to others, the majority, alas, it was a private and peculiar Hades that could give the original institution points and a beating. When Edward was observed to be swaggering round with a jaunty air and his chest stuck out, I knew that he was contemplating his future from the one point of view. When, on the contrary, he was subdued and unaggressive and sought the society of his sisters, I recognised that the other aspect was in the ascendant. "You can always run away, you know," I used to remark consolingly on these latter occasions, and Edward would brighten up wonderfully at the suggestion, while Charlotte melted into tears before her vision of a brother with blistered feet and an empty belly passing nights of frost neath the lee of windy haystacks. It was to Edward, of course, that the situation was chiefly productive of anxiety, and yet the ensuing change in my own circumstances and position furnished me also with food for grave reflection. Hitherto I had acted mostly to orders. Even when I had devised and counselled any particular devilry, it had been carried out on Edward's approbation, and, as eldest, at his special risk. Henceforward it began to be anxious of the bugbear responsibility, and to realise what a soul-throttling thing it is. True, my new position would have its compensations. Edward had been masterful exceedingly, imperious perhaps a little narrow, impassioned for hard facts and with scant sympathy for make-believe. I should now be free and untrammelled. In the conception and the carrying out of a scheme, I could accept and reject to better artistic purpose. It would, moreover, be needless to be a radical any more. Radical I never was, really, by nature or by sympathy. The part had been thrust on me one day when Edward proposed to foist the House of Lords on our small republic. The principles of the thing he set forth learnedly and well, and it all sounded promising enough, till he went on to explain that, for the present at least, he proposed to be the House of Lords himself. We others were to be the Commons. There would be promotions, of course, to be added, dependent on service and on fitness, and open to both sexes, and to me in especial he held out hopes of speedy advancement. But in its initial stages the thing wouldn't work properly unless he were first and only Lord. Then I put my foot down promptly and said it was all rot, and I didn't see the good of any House of Lords at all. "Then you must be a low radical," said Edward, with fine contempt. The inference seemed hardly necessary, but what could I do? I accepted the situation and said firmly, yes, I was a low radical. In this monstrous character I had been obliged to masquerade ever since, but now I could throw it off and look the world in the face again. And yet, did this and other gains really outbalance my losses? Henceforth I should, it was true, be leader and chief, but I should also be the buffer between the Olympians and my little clan. To Edward this had been nothing. He had withstood the impact of Olympus without flinching, like Tenerife or Atlas unmoved. But was I equal to the task? And was there not rather a danger that for the sake of peace and quietness I might be tempted to compromise, compound, and make terms, sinking thus by successive lapses into the blameless prig? I don't mean, of course, that I thought out my thoughts to the exact point here set down. In those fortunate days of old, one was free from the hard necessity of transmuting the vague idea into the mechanical, inadequate medium of words. But the feeling was there, that I might not possess the qualities of character for so delicate a position. The unnatural halo round Edward got more pronounced, his own demeanour more responsible and dignified, with the arrival of his new clothes. When his trunk and playbox were sent in, the approaching cleavage between our brother, who now belonged to the future, and ourselves, still claimed by the past, was accentuated indeed. His name was painted on each of them in large letters, and after their arrival their owner used to disappear mysteriously and be found eventually wandering round his luggage, murmuring to himself, "Edward," in a rapt, remote sort of way. It was a weakness, of course, and pointed to a soft spot in his character, but those who can remember the sensation of first seeing their names in print will not think hardly of him. As the short days sped by and the grim event cast its shadow longer and longer across our threshold, an unnatural politeness, a civility scarce canny, began to pervade the air. In those latter hours Edward himself was frequently heard to say, "Please," and also, "Would you mind fetching that bottle?" while Harold and I would sometimes actually find ourselves trying to anticipate his wishes. As for the girls, they simply grovelled. The Olympians, too, in their uncouth way, by gift of carnal delicacies and such like indulgence, seemed anxious to demonstrate that they had hitherto misjudged this one of us. Altogether the situation grew strained and false, and I think a general relief was felt when the end came. We all trooped down to the station, of course. It is only in later years that the farce of seeing people off is seen in its true colours. Edward was the life and soul of the party, and if his gaiety struck one at times as being a trifle overdone, it was not a moment to be critical. As we tramped along, I promised him I would ask Farmer Larkin not to kill any more pigs till he came back for the holidays, and he said he would send me a proper catapult, the real lethal article, not a kid's plaything. Then suddenly, when we were about halfway down, one of the girls fell a-snivelling. The happy few who dare to laugh at the woes of seasickness will perhaps remember how, on occasion, the sudden collapse of a fellow voyager before their very eyes has caused them hastily to revise their self-confidence and resolve to walk more humbly in future. Even so, it was with Edward who turned his head aside, feigning an interest in the landscape. It was but for a moment. Then he recollected the hat he was wearing, a hard bowler, the first of that sort he had ever owned. He took it off, examined it, and felt it over. Something about it seemed to give him strength, and he was a man once more. At the station, Edward's first care was to dispose his boxes on the platform so that everyone might see the labels and the lettering thereon. One did not go to school for the first time every day. Then he read both sides of his ticket carefully, shifted it to every one of his pockets in turn, and finally fell to chinking of his money to keep his courage up. We were all dry of conversation by this time, and could only stand round and stare in silence at the victim decked for the altar. And as I looked at Edward, in new clothes of a manly cut, with a hard hat upon his head, a railway ticket in one pocket, and money of his own in the other, money to spend as he liked and no questions asked, I began to feel dimly how great was the gulf already yawning betwixt us. Fortunately, I was not old enough to realise, further, that here on this little platform the old order lay at its last gasp, and that Edward might come back to us, but it would not be the Edward of yore, nor could things ever be the same again. When the train steamed up at last, we all boarded it impetuously with the view of selecting the one peerless carriage to which Edward might be entrusted with the greatest comfort and honour, and as each one found the ideal compartment at the same moment and vociferously maintained its merits, he stood some chance for a time of being left behind. A porter settled the matter by heaving him through the nearest door, and as the train moved off, Edward's head was thrust out of the window, wearing on it an unmistakable first-quality grin that he had been saving up somewhere for the supreme moment. Very small and white his face looked on the long side of the retreating train, but the grin was visible, undeniable, stoutly maintained, till a curve swept him from our sight, and he was borne away in the dying rumble out of our placid backwater, out into the busy world of rubs and knocks and competition, out into the new life. When a crab has lost a leg, his gait is still more awkward than his wont, till time and healing nature make him totus teres atque rotundus once more. We straggled back from the station disjointedly. Harold, who was very silent, sticking close to me, his last slender prop, while the girls in front, their heads together, were already reckoning up the weeks to the holidays. Home at last, Harold suggested one or two occupations of a spicy and contraband flavour, but though we did our manful best, there was no knocking any interest out of them. Then I suggested others with the same want of success. Finally, we found ourselves sitting silent on an upturned wheelbarrow, our chins on our fists, staring haggardly into this raw, new condition of our changed life, the ruins of a past left behind our backs. And all the while Selina and Charlotte were busy stuffing Edward's rabbits with unwanted forage, bilious and green, polishing up the cage of his mice till the occupants raved and swore like householders in springtime, and collecting materials for new bows and arrows, whips, boats, guns, and four-in-hand harness against the return of Ulysses. Little did they dream that the hero, once back from Troy, and all its onsets, would scornfully condemn their clumsy but laborious armoury as rot and humbug and only fit for kids. This, with many another like awakening, was mercifully hidden from them. Could the veil have been lifted and the girls permitted to see Edward, as he would appear a short 3 months hence, ragged of attire and lawless of tongue, a scorner of tradition and an adept in strange new physical tortures, one who would in the same half-hour dismember a doll and shatter a hallowed belief, in fine, a sort of swaggering captain fresh from the Spanish Main. Could they have had the least hint of this? Well, then, perhaps. But which of us is of mental fibre to stand the test of a glimpse into futurity? Let us only hope that, even with certain disillusionment ahead, the girls would have acted precisely as they did. And perhaps we have reason to be very grateful that, both as children and long afterwards, we were never allowed to guess how the absorbing pursuit of the moment will appear, not only to others but to ourselves, a very short time hence. So we pass with a gusto and a heartiness that to an onlooker would seem almost pathetic, from one droll devotion to another misshapen passion. And one who shall dare to play Rhadamanthus, to appraise the record and to decide how much of it is solid achievement and how much the merest child's play. The end.